back. You're in the C Space Studio here at CES 2024. I am James Kotecki, and I am joined by Deloitte's own Jana Arbanas, and you have a great title, which I will make sure I read to get it right. Vice Chair, U.S. Telecom Media and Entertainment Sector Leader at Deloitte. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk trends. I imagine a lot of what you do is think about trends, try to predict the future, the near future. We're here at a show that's all about future trends, so let's get into it.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about in terms of entertainment? We're here at C Space, let's talk content entertainment.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm really focused on like what's happening, what's really going to be disruptive kind of in next generation. And actually led a panel yesterday with a group of executives kind of across different parts of the media landscape. And we talked specifically about kind of the disruption that we're going to see from a content development perspective and really not only the convergence that's happening that's causing disruption, but then ultimately generative AI's role in sort of the future of content development. So it was a really fascinating conversation. In addition to that, I actually spoke at the Equality Lounge. We talked a little bit about women in tech, which is another kind of piece of the trend in terms of inclusion of tech and consumers more broadly. And so that was another interesting sort of trend that we're focused on.
I want to get into it all. Let's start with the Equality Lounge a little bit. What were some of the thoughts that came up there? And I speak to Shelly Zalis, also as part of the C Space Studio. We'll be talking to her tomorrow.
Oh, great.
And so these issues are things that we talk about here every year. From your perspective, where do we stand? Where do we need to go?
Yeah, so we're not in great shape, to be totally honest. I mean, really, from a representation perspective, I think we're hovering around 25% of women in tech. And I would say that what we're seeing is that there's still a considerable amount of attrition, right around sort of mid-career. We don't see people ascending to leadership, people who are joining early in their career. They're in some cases not finding alignment from a cultural perspective. They think about kind of long-term, personal priorities start to come into play kind of in your mid-30s, and in many cases we're seeing a lot of women leaving the tech field and looking for better cultural alignment. And so I think what we talked about a lot is just sort of what organizations need to be doing in order to retain those women, in order to create cultures where they feel that cultural alignment with. And in my opinion, I think it also helps create this like inclusivity in tech too. So if you think about gaming, for example, if you have a low number of women executives in gaming, the content and the gaming that's being created is not necessarily for women. And yet we're 50% of the consumer population. And so to leave that population out doesn't make sense for anyone from a business perspective. So I would just say, I think there's a lot of acknowledgement that it's really important to get closer to gender, equity from a representation perspective, but we've got a long way to go.
Do you think part of the problem is that these challenges take longer to solve than the tenure of the leaders who are there to try and solve them?
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, and I think that leaders come and go. To your point, priorities shift, right, depending upon what's happening in the economy. And so we've seen sort of varied levels of commitment, right? People try something new, then they think they're in an okay place, and then they sort of let some of the programming fall away, and then they're sort of back where they were. So you're absolutely right. It's a significant challenge that we're looking for multi-year kind of significant cultural shifts that really are going to be the only way to address it.
You mentioned being on a panel about content as well. Any aha moments coming out of that, especially as it relates to Gen AI? Anything that kind of surprised you from maybe what you thought of or what other people said?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting dialogue out there right now that like generative AI is going to create so much content and so much noise. It's going to be overwhelming and sort of like drown everyone. And in fact, what we talked about was perhaps the opposite is true, and that really it's actually going to make it just easier for amazing content and really creative content to be brought to life. And just the notion that you'll be using tools almost as like a co-pilot to sort of like skip over some of the hard parts, right, about content creation, using these tools to just get to market faster and focus on the authentic pieces of it and let the tech do the rest, kind of the background for you, if you will.
I imagine, you talk about, theoretically, I suppose there could be an unlimited amount of content created. There's not an unlimited amount of human minds to kind of receive that content, right? There's only so many people on the planet and so many hours in the day for them to actually take this stuff. And so is that kind of the idea that the best stuff will still rise to the top and get shared and distributed?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we also talked about is just this notion of like fierce competition. Like in the past you would have thought about competition in gaming or competition in TV and film or competition in social media. Now those are all blending together. And so there's, social media is competing with gaming, is competing with TV. It's all interrelated. And so I think that is also interesting. To your point, we only have so many hours in the day. How do we decide to make choices? It has to be really compelling for us to spend our time on it.
Yeah. So you feel bullish and optimistic about Gen AI yourself?
I do. I think it's going to actually create greater access, frankly. That's one of the things we also talked about, is just sort of an individual that doesn't maybe have a deep coding background or access to education from a development perspective will be able to leapfrog some of that really challenging elements of the creative process.
Interwoven with all this, of course, is advertising. And so what kind of advertising trends are you also thinking about at the same time as you weave these things together?
Yeah, well, I personally think advertising is going through a dramatic shift. So if you really step back and think about it, right, we have streaming platforms that are now building their own ad platforms, right, in order to provide relevant ads to their consumers. You have ads appearing in gaming at this time. And then you have social media, which combines traditional ads, but also creators and influencers. And what we're hearing from younger generations is that they find creators and influencers to be much more, authentic and trustworthy. And so what will be really interesting is, how does the traditional sort of advertising landscape take harness of that sort of that trust that's created with the younger generation, and how do we see creators and influencers show up in other mediums, right?
Yeah.
But then also, how do you use each of those channels as a brand? How do I show up in each of those channels authentically with the right audience in mind, and how do I create, that engagement through the different channels that are available?
I mean, we talk about streaming platforms, and we talk about influencers being on places like, YouTube and TikTok and Instagram. From the perspective of, I'm just going to use my kids for an example. Yeah. I'm not sure they really care too much about which of those things are which. And so from an advertising perspective, or from your perspective, do you see that those things need to be conceptualized as different verticals? Does it make more sense to think about that blend? You mentioned influencers showing up in other mediums. Is that part of what you're talking about?
I think it is true, generally speaking, but there is a little bit of a difference, between the different brands. And even so, I have a 12-year-old and a 16-year-old, and what they gravitate to is different. And so I would just say there is some acknowledgement that needs to happen about, like, the age of the consumer, and is the consumer going there to be entertained, to be educated, to communicate with friends, right? So I think each of them have a slight nuance. You should have a robust strategy that covers all of them, though, to your point. I don't think they have to be completely in isolation, but there are unique nuances to them.
I want to make sure we talk gaming just a little bit more. Anything to get excited about for 2024?
Yeah, I mean, gaming has just continued to take off, I would say, and what we're continuing to see is greater realism, greater immersion, which is creating a more and more unique experience. I talked earlier about inclusivity. I also think that there's greater just options now relative to gaming. So in the past, some of the most popular games have been first-person shooter games. Those don't appeal broadly to everyone, certainly less so with women. And so I think we're seeing more diversification in terms of the types of games that are available. And those games are great games. They're immersive games. They're, realistic. I'd also say, historically, consoles have sometimes been a barrier, right? If you could afford the best gaming console, that's the only way you're going to get a great experience. That's changing with some of the, the cloud, ways in which you can connect through gaming and do it on your phone, and so it creates democratization from a gaming perspective too. So I anticipate gaming to continue to get traction. We see it has traction already across generations, but it's going to get even greater.
Another thing we talk about blending sometimes is real life and life online. And I wonder if that kind of continuum might kind of become more blurry as well, as people spend increasing amounts of time with consuming this content, and VR and AR is obviously a component of that, but even just looking at screens, I've kind of often wondered, is that distinction going to be as meaningful in the future? What do you think about that?
I think it's a good question. I think as a parent, maybe you, I've been worried about screen time and managing screen time. But during COVID, I really sort of changed my perspective when it was the only way for my son to get to engage with his friends, right? Because they weren't going to school, they weren't really able to connect outside. And so I think there's an acknowledgement that we all have to have around how it enables connection. And I think there's really great ways in which our younger generation are exploring technology, getting exposed to technology in a way that we weren't. And we have barriers now that we don't, I struggle sometimes to play with my son gaming because I'm like, oh wow, I didn't know it could do that, and he knows how it works, from the get-go. So I do think that the gaming, and just really thinking about how an online experience isn't just screen time, but it actually can have meaningful connection. In fact, in some of our research, 50% of Gen Z and millennials felt that their online experience was as important as an in-person experience.
Yeah.
And so that reach that it enables, I think, is really important. And so I think we're going to find this, you're right, it's going to become more blurry, and we're going to continue to try to work to find a balance between what's really great online and what's really great in person.
I mean, my kids are 9 and 6, and I think, we may be that. So, I mean, I didn't have all these rules about screen time growing up, and I wonder how my kids, and maybe your kids, will tell their kids about how to deal with screens. We may be this singular kind of sandwich generation of parents that's obsessed with it, and on either end, it's not going to be as big of a deal.
I think you could be right.
Well, Jana Arbanas of Deloitte, thank you so much for joining us here in the C Space Studio. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And thank you so much. We really appreciate you watching us here. We're in the C Space Studio at CES 2023. I'm James Kotecki. More great conversations are just ahead. Stay with us.